Excellent. So we are actually incredibly pleased today to be having one of our very own speakers. First, I'm Mandana Khalili. I'm professor of medicine and director of the UCSF Research Coordinating Center's development unit for the NIMHD Health Equity Action Network. I'd like to welcome you to our monthly training webinar. Before we start, we would like to ensure that everyone is aware that you can ask any questions throughout the presentation. And if you wish to ask questions as well through chat, please don't hesitate to let us know, and we'll be sure to address them. As stated earlier, today we are honored to have our very own Dr. Edwin Charlebois speak to us about imposter syndrome, building resilience. Dr. Charlebois is an infectious disease epidemiologist and professor of medicine in the Department of Medicine here at UCSF. He's also the director of the NIMH-funded postdoctoral T32 traineeship in AIDS prevention studies program, and a co-director of the Methods Biostatistics Core within the UCSF Center for AIDS Prevention Studies. He's a multiple PI and co-director of the Research Coordinating Center for Heme Equity Action Network, our current network, and the associate director for our Investigator Skills Development Unit. Prior to the Health Disparities Consortium, Dr. Charlebois directed data collection and coordination efforts of a cluster randomized trial involving collection of clinical research data across more than 100 sites spanning 2 East African countries. He has done quite a bit of investigation globally. He's also served as the data core lead, co-investigator, and senior biostatistician on numerous biomedical and behavioral clinical trials. He's got significant experience in community HIV testing among disparity population, including persons experiencing homelessness and marginally housed individuals. And he's conducted intervention implementation analysis of multiple healthcare and behavioral intervention in US and also in Africa. Needless to say, Dr. Charlebois has significant experience in education, training, and skills development. And he has had a significant number of postdoctoral students, junior faculty, among others. And we could not be more grateful for him to tell us about this very important topic. And we look forward to your presentation, Dr. Charlebois.
Thank you, Mandana. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So good day and good afternoon. For today's skills development webinar, we're going to be discussing imposter syndrome, or more accurately referred to as imposter phenomena. A little bit more on the distinction later. Today, I'm going to pretend to be knowledgeable about imposter syndrome, and I can tell you I'm feeling a little bit of a fraud myself, much like this cartoon here. But I think we're going to power through. So we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. We're not going to be talking about actual imposters, intentional frauds. So what is imposter syndrome? What do I mean when I say imposter syndrome? Well, imposter syndrome, also known as imposter phenomenon, fraud syndrome, perceived fraudulence, or imposter experience, describes the experience and situation for high-achieving individuals who, despite their very objective successes, fail to internalize their accomplishments and have this persistent self-doubt and fear of being exposed as a fraud. People with imposter syndrome struggle with accurately attributing, their really fantastic performance to their actual level of competence. They'll often think, "Oh, I just got lucky this time," or "I'm not really as good as everyone seems to tell me and think I am." It can be characterized by a constant state of anxiety and fear, like, "Oh, they're going to find out that I'm not really as smart or competent as I think I am." As Dr. Khalili said, I'm a professor of medicine at UCSF. fraud, not a real MD. Also director of the Research Coordinating Center for 11 disparities research centers across the U.S. This $300 million initiative funded by Congress. Oh my God, I'm so over my head. And I also teach the postdoctoral training program, as Mandana said. You know, why are they listening to me? You know, over my 40 years of academic and clinical research, I never once had a class, had a lecture, or had the concept of imposter phenomena or experience come up in a mentoring session. I myself, this is my disclosure to you, is like despite all the fantastic things I've been able to do and achievements, I've struggled with imposter syndrome all of my life, even to this day, as these little pop-up thoughts that I put on the screen, which are really popping up into my head even as I speak. I can tell you, however, that it gets better. You are going to be able to, there are a number of things you can do. You really can learn to recognize imposter phenomena for what it is, a distortion from reality, a way of thinking, negatively ingrained thought patterns. You can develop skills and approaches to manage and cope with imposter phenomena in the moment when it happens with you. I'm going to try and present some of those to you here now. And in addition, you can build resiliency to minimize the impact of feeling like an imposter or imposter phenomena, and potentially even reduce or prevent its occurrence in the future. So where did the concept of imposter syndrome or imposter phenomena come from? Well, the first appearance of the concept came in 1978 by psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, who were in the process of doing therapy and counseling sessions with about 150 women who were high achieving themselves. They were both graduate students, professors, people from other universities, and in these sessions, over a period of 5 years, the two psychologists identified this recurrent theme and pattern of women, these very objectively very accomplished women, feeling like frauds and imposters, and they relayed these fears of being found out. And so they published this really great seminal paper, The Imposter Phenomena and High Achieving Women, Dynamics and Therapeutic Invention, in the Journal of Psychotherapy and Research Practice in 1978. And that's kind of the first time we see this concept given a name. And they actually termed its first origination was this term imposter phenomenon. Since that time, numerous research papers on imposter phenomena or imposter syndrome have been published. More recent research has documented this same experience and feelings and ways of thinking and feelings of inadequacy among men and women in many professional settings, among multiple ethnic and racial groups. And more and more, we're starting to see this in literature and emergence into popular culture. Research has shown a number of associations with this imposter syndrome or phenomena. Imposter syndrome affects women and minority groups disproportionately, although there's some emerging evidence that some of that may be due to reporting phenomena. Imposter syndrome is often comorbid with serious depression and anxiety, and is associated in terms of negative job performance, job satisfaction, higher probabilities of burnout among various employee populations, including clinicians and academic researchers. Now, the term imposter syndrome is kind of the popular one, as we saw from the early days. It actually is more appropriately described as imposter phenomena. It's not an actual syndrome. It's not a recognized psychiatric disorder. It doesn't appear in the APA's DSM manual, and it's not listed in the ICD-10 International Code of Diagnoses and Diseases 11. So it really is more appropriately termed imposter phenomena. As I said, imposter syndrome has emerged into popular culture. People who we have no doubt are talented, successful, and not only competent but outstanding in the media have been reporting, the imposter syndrome feelings. And here's some great quotes. And we can all agree that Team DeFay is an amazingly competent and talented person. But even her, she says, for her, the beauty of imposter syndrome is that you vacillate between extreme egomania, I'm great, things are going great, and this complete feeling of I'm a fraud. Oh God, they're on to me. I'm a fraud. Maya Angelou also, the prize-winning author said once after publishing her 11th book that every time she wrote another one, she'd think to herself, uh-oh, now they're going to find out that, I've been running this game on everyone. And another I think impactful discussion that I've heard several times from former First Lady Michelle Obama, who is amazingly accomplished in numerous fields. She's spoken at length about imposter syndrome for herself, but being in settings where she's not like everybody else, and questioning herself, do I really belong here? Am I an imposter? She said that she used to lie awake at night asking herself, like, oh my God, am I too loud? Am I too much? Am I dreaming too big? And this gives us some hint at some of the negative impacts that imposter phenomena can produce. This effect of self-censoring. And these are just a few of the high-profile individuals who I think we can all agree are incredibly accomplished, who relate this experience has been a factor in their lives as well. It's hard to determine what the true prevalence of imposter syndrome is out there. Valerie Young, who researches the private sector and is a major imposter syndrome lecturer, has identified really high prevalences of reports of imposter syndrome or phenomena. 70% of successful people report experiencing imposter feelings at some point in their life. 3/4 of executive women say they've experienced imposter syndrome. The higher you go, it seems the more prevalence of these concerns and anxieties about being an imposter or being found out. 80% of CEOs have report feeling out of their depths, and particularly those emerging into new settings seem to be susceptible to this imposter phenomena. Recently, before the pandemic in 2020, a review of the prevalence predictors and treatment of imposter syndrome by Bravata and colleagues surveyed the literature, and they found 62 studies that talked about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomena. And among those, half were published in the last 6 years. The prevalence rates of imposter syndrome in this review varied widely from 9% to 82%, largely depending on the screening tool and cutoffs that were used. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the tools that have been used in measuring imposter phenomena. In this review, they did find that imposter phenomena was common among both men and women and across a range of age groups, adolescents to late stage professionals. And at that time in 2020, they didn't find any published studies on treatments, on evaluated treatments for dealing with imposter phenomena or syndromes. That's no longer true. And I'm actually going to present to you some of the more recent treatment information that has come out. So how How in the field has imposter phenomena been measured? There are a number of scales. Probably the one that gets used the most is the CIPS, the Clance Imposter Phenomena Scale. From the Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, the original originators of the concept of imposter phenomena. A couple of others that are out there that get used frequently are the Harvey Imposter Phenomenon Scale, the Leary Imposter Scale, and a couple of newer ones that precede Fraudulent Scale and Young Imposter Scale. What do these look like? Here's an example of the CIPS, the Clance IP scale, and you can see the types of questions that get asked. You know, I have often succeeded on a task or a test, even though I was afraid I would not do well before I undertook the task. You know, with a Likert scale. I avoid evaluations if possible. I have a dread of other people evaluating me. Sometimes I obtain my present position or gain my present success because I happen to be at the right place, the right time. Again, touching on that thought that, well, my success is just due to luck. It's not really due to my level of competence or my skills. So that the Clance scale is fairly lengthy. It's about 20 questions. You can get through it quite quickly, but I don't know that the font here is really, really small. But you can see the kinds of domains and things that it touches on. Competence, self-evaluation, comparison with others, attribution. You know, what's my success due to? You know, external factors that say nothing about me, and things like that. A much shorter one that folks have found useful has been this Leary imposterism scale. Just seven items, much faster. And I think this is a useful one to look at. And in looking at these scales, I'm sure as you're doing right now, I often look at these and think, well, aren't these things that everybody experiences at some point in their life? And while that is true, it's the magnitude and the frequency of which these feelings and thoughts and these experiences happen that seem to be a predominant feature of people who report impacts and negative consequences of this imposter phenomena. Because of this particular, what we're, the Health Equity Action Network, one of the things that we're particularly interested in is disparities in situation, in experience, and outcomes, and particularly in this arena of imposter phenomena research, we see that minority groups may be especially susceptible to the incidence or reporting of imposter phenomena and its impact. A really significant study in 2013 by Coakley from UT Austin surveyed ethnic minority college students and found that Asian Americans were actually more likely than African Americans or Latino Americans to experience imposter feelings, and deeper evaluations of this and the potential causal thinking and pathways of that have been really interesting. People talking about model minority stressors. Interesting in that paper, also the researchers found that imposter feelings more strongly predicted mental health problems than even measures of minority stress, which is interesting. So there's to me it appears there, and to the researchers, there's this complicated relationship between the experience of minority stress, of belongingness, and susceptibility to and imposter phenomena and its negative consequences for mental health, for academic advancement, for participation and belonging. Other findings in the literature indicate that imposter phenomena moderate the relationship between perceived racial discrimination and mental health outcomes, particularly for Black students. And I think this is just reinforcing, and we've seen this in multiple studies now, that imposter phenomena is particularly harmful for students of color's mental health. Among other marginalized groups, like LGBTQ individuals, these findings seem to hold true in individuals, even in academics, who in arenas where they are actually the content experts themselves. Individuals in LGBTQ studies departments, et cetera, find that these feelings and higher prevalences of imposter syndrome are present there. Valerie Young, as I mentioned earlier, studies the private sector, and she's particularly found and reported a number of really significant impacts on institutions, on individuals, on businesses. Employees who experience and report imposter syndrome are much more likely to hold back on sharing ideas and asking questions. They don't get promoted. That experience is associated with not being promoted as fast. Individuals with high levels of imposter syndrome or phenomena over-personalize constructive feedback, making it difficult to actually improve in performance. And those experiencing IPs also have a tendency to overwork and over-prepare, ending up with lower perceptions of lower productivity by their employers. At the organizational level, it appears that imposter phenomena has impact on the fewer generation of ideas and solutions, lost opportunities, really impacting the organization as a whole. Retention of employees and imposter phenomena seem to be highly correlated factors. Let's see. And then, that's the organization. But I think really significant are the human costs associated with imposter phenomena. Imposter phenomena have been highly linked to symptoms of depression and generalized anxiety, problems with low self-esteem. Individuals with high imposter feelings also have poor mental health outcomes and potentially increases in negative physiologic effects from constant anxiety, heightened arousal states, elevated stress hormones, and cortisol. And there have also been links to suicidal ideation among physicians and in adolescents, linking those experiences of imposter phenomena, feeling like a fraud, and probably reporting suicidal thoughts. So really significant, impacts to the individual, to organizations and institutions. So where does this imposter phenomena come from? There are a lot of associations out there in the literature and a lot of theories as to causal mechanisms and pathways, and it's difficult to synthesize them all because there are so many associations that are out there. I like to group them into three clusters or levels. So thinking about the individual level, the associations between imposter phenomena, they've seen high relationships with anxiety and depression. So people who are at risk for or experiencing anxiety and depression seem to be also equally at risk for imposter phenomena. There's some questions about the causal direction of those factors, and I think that has still yet to be teased out in the literature. There are observed sex differences at the individual level in terms of susceptibility and to imposter phenomena. Some of that has been attributed to the differences in socialization. Boys at young ages are taught to be, are to not to show vulnerability, to engage in activities that are new to them. And some of the messaging around for younger girls is actually quite different. The things that reward are different. That's been proposed. Also at the individual level, factors that seem to be associated with a higher prevalence of imposter syndrome are internalization challenges. And what I mean by that is, when you have a positive achievement, being able to accept that your efforts, your work, your worth are actually what was responsible for that. So the ability to take that in and have that become part of your core belief seems to be a major driving factor. And as I said, the causal directions of some of these things are still under investigation. One area of research that was originally identified by Clance and Imes had to do with the family, a family of origin. Families, and particularly in their early studies, they were looking at different types of messaging that women received in their families of origin, and they found two distinct patterns. One was in situations where there was a sibling, the sibling who had been identified as as the golden child or the intelligent or the smart one. These women with high levels of IP, conversely, had been told, like, no, you're the sensitive one. You have good people skills. The other kind of group of women that they found who were at risk for imposter phenomena were those who were told that they were their star child. Like everything they do was perfect. They were fantastic. They were good at everything. So both of those experiences early on in childhood seem to be associated with risks for more experience of imposter phenomena. Other associations within family origins, being a first-generation college attendee seems to put individuals at increased risk to experience imposter phenomena. Family upbringings where there was mixed messaging and differential validation seems to contribute to a higher probability of experiencing imposter phenomena later in life. Rewards or validation that focused on, like, oh, you got a 99%, like, oh, what a shame, rather than like, oh my God, what next time, let's try for 100, or an inconsistent things. Also, the things that we learn in early childhood are our relationship and our concept of failure. Healthy relationships to failure. That failure is a human thing. It happens. It's part of growth. It's an opportunity to learn. Are negatively associated with later development of imposter phenomena, as makes sense. Those individuals who learned that failure was to be avoided at all costs, that it was a terrible thing, that was life-threatening, like those sorts of early definitions and relationships to failure seem to put people at in particular risk for later imposter phenomena. And then there are the structural drivers, I think, of and contributors to imposter phenomena. And these are a number of the isms: sexism, racism, in any of the other isms, heterosexism. These in research have shown to have an important and potentially very significant driving factor for the experience of imposter phenomena. And I think in our postdoctoral training programs and our discussions around imposter phenomena and the experiences of persons of color in our training program, you can very clearly see the links between those. When you're in a situation where you've risen through your own competence and success to a level, and you're in a situation where you don't look or you don't sound like everybody else. Internally there are a number of thoughts about, like, do I really belong here? So that sense of belonging can be a trigger for imposter phenomena. Also, the way you get treated, that differential thing sets you apart. Maybe I'm not as talented or as smart as everybody around there. What hasn't been studied too much are some of the impacts of the intersectionality that occurs among marginalized groups. Also, organizational culture. Those cultures, for those coming from medicine, medical training in past generations had been fairly shame based. If you were on rounds and you didn't get something right, you were kind of publicly shamed in the group. So organizational cultures can seem to foster or protect against imposter phenomena, depending on how those exist within companies and organizations. So these are in my mind, trying to untangle these. I think a lot more research needs to be done on the development and risks for imposter phenomena. But one thing that seems that ties across these seem to be, for me, are these experiences that develop these well-worn patterns of thinking in how we measure, how we value ourselves, and how we attribute our successes or our level of competence to innate factors versus external ones. Valerie Young, in her research in imposter phenomena and syndrome, has posed that there are 5 kind of classes, latent classes of imposter phenomena experience. And she labels these the perfectionist, the expert, the soloist, the natural genius, and the superhuman. And take a look at some of these definitions and that she's put forth. The perfectionist focuses on how something is done, the work, how it's conducted, how it turns out. Particular emphasis there for the perfectionist is that one minor flaws and minor errors would be avoided at all case, in all cases. So that focusing on competence equals perfectionism. She identifies that we have these internal scripts for ourselves that relate to our view of competency, and they kind of go like, okay, if I were really competent, I would blank. And so kind of think about those for yourself. If I was really an expert in infectious diseases, I were really an expert scuba diver, I would and for me, I recognize a number of these in the scripts, but she posits that there's we each have a different mix. We don't necessarily only fit into one of these, but some of those internalized scripts for ourselves match some of these. The expert, the expert believes that he or she needs to know everything. Like, you need to be the complete expert, so not knowing something is not acceptable. If you were competent, you would know everything. The soloist, as the name implies, you should be able, your scripts are, if I were really competent, I should be able to do this all myself. It's like, I don't need anybody else. I don't need anything else. Like, I should be enough. And of course, that's never going to be true, and it's never going to be true in all cases. The natural genius is, and this is one of the areas that I fall into. When I was very young, I was identified and put into a mentally gifted minor program. What a both wonderful thing to do to a child, and a horrible thing to do to a child who is already somewhat different. As one of those children, you come to believe that everything should be easy. You should be able to do everything well. Nothing takes work. You're so bright. You should be able to get things instantly. And when that doesn't happen, you criticize yourself. Maybe I'm not that child. I've been told this all my life, but that I'm not doing this easily. So they must have been wrong. And so that's kind of the natural genius, and that crazy script is like, everything should be easy, everything should be instantaneous. And the last is the superhuman script, which is the superhuman believes that, well, I should be able to do everything equally well all the time. Falling short in any arena. Not being able to do something new completely well. great at work. I should be equally great at, at sports. I should be equally great at, at parenting, those sorts of things. I need to be great and, super mom, superwoman, superman all the time. So these are kind of, I think these are interesting, categorizations. They're not necessarily like proven scientifically. You can imagine that there might be some latent classes here that you could investigate further. But they do, I think, give you hints to the type of faulty and negative thinking and scripts that may be driving one's experience of imposter syndrome. One of the hallmarks of this imposter phenomena experience that originally came from Clance and Imes was the frequency of what they called the imposter cycle. These cycles of negative reinforcement and discounting that seem to occur in individuals who experience high levels of imposter phenomena. So they start off with like, here's, you've got a task or a new job or something, you've got anxiety about that. I don't know how to do this, or I'm worried I'm not going to be great at this, etc. And there are kind of two pathways. One is over preparation. You often see, so those perfectionists often spend a lot of time and mental and physical and temporal energy in over preparing to ensure that they don't feel. And when things go right, there's this amazing feeling of relief, some positive feedback. However, the problems start to occur there for people who are on that over preparation pathway is that attribution of that hard work and success does mean that I'm competent, etc. They actually use that the fact that I had to prepare so hard to discount the positive success. So so that discounting that occurs in this dash pattern and effort is a way to not integrate that those successes into one's self-worth and one's feeling about self-efficacy and competency. Another potential pathway that Clance and I saw quite a bit was a response to that anxiety was a procrastination. It's like, oh, I'm really worried about that, etc. And then doing a lot, and then last minute achieving the task. And in the cases where success happened, the discounting that happens around there was, oh, that wasn't due to me being smart and like, wow, look, I can, even when I didn't give it the amount of time it should have had, I was able to rise to the challenge. You get it? No, the faulty thinking there is like, oh God, I just got really lucky this time. Nobody noticed, or it really had nothing. It really had nothing to do with me. It was just chance that came like, and so that discounting process seems to be a really strong feature of imposter cycle, and points to that challenge with integration of success into self-worth. In the literature, and also again by Clance and Imes, there are these like 4 types of behaviors which tend to maintain the imposter phenomena. That cycle appears in this first box here on the upper left, the cycles of anxiety and diligence and hard work that happen. Individuals with high levels of imposter phenomena also are more likely to use charm and perceptiveness to try and win the approval of superiors. So a little bit on the manipulative side of things. Maintaining imposter beliefs in response to negative consequences that are likely to befall women in their studies, were interesting and feed into our society's challenge around women who display confidence in their ability. Another thing, and we saw this in that quote from former First Lady Michelle Obama, engaging in intellectual inauthenticity choosing at times not to reveal your ideas or options or those things you think, because you're not, you lack that certainty that you really are an expert, or you really are talented, and that there's too much risk in putting your voice and opinion out there, because people are going to discover that you're actually a fraud. So these are these are for particular patterns of behaviors in response to those anxieties and experience of imposter phenomena that have been identified in the literature. Additionally, dealing with that anxiety and fear of being found out leads to coping mechanisms, and these aren't necessarily positive coping mechanisms. These are like how individuals unconsciously try to manage those levels of anxieties, and you can see here some of those appearing again: holding back, flying under the radar, over preparing, use of charm, procrastinating, never finishing. If you never finish a project or a work, you can't be evaluated. It's not going to be revealed that that you're not as competent as everyone seems to think you are. Maintaining a low or ever-changing profile. And probably the most detrimental are acts of self-sabotage. Giving yourself a reason why why something didn't work out, because you were really afraid that if you gave it your all, you would fail. So you self-sacrifice. So to some, like all coping strategies, what may initially be adaptive and work for you, over time may become maladaptive. And truly, like, these are not sustainable coping mechanisms for dealing with the anxieties and the fears around in imposter syndrome and imposter phenomena. So what can you do? Like, how do you build resiliency towards protecting yourself and dealing with imposter phenomena, those feelings, those negative and distorted thoughts? Well, one of the Kelly Vincent, I just listened to a really great audiobook recently. She does a quick kind of overview of what's out there in this field. We're really lucky. I think later in the year we're going to have an ISDU webinar, particularly on building resiliency. But I just wanted to touch on a little bit on what's out there, and hopefully we're going to be getting a lot more on building resiliency. But one of the first areas where we can work on is rewiring your brain. We have a number of those inaccurate thoughts and relationships with competency. So one of the things we can do is work with ourselves and others on shifting our relationship and our conceptualizations of failure in competency. Moving from a failure is fatal mindset to failure is an opportunity to learn. Failure is necessary for growth. Failure is human. Those sorts of things, and then thinking about and looking and trying to unravel and rewire those internal scripts we have around competency. If I were truly smart, I would never get anything wrong. Okay, that's irrational. That's a distortion. That's not true. So working on reframing those things for yourself. And there's research. The brain is amazingly plastic. Neuroplasticity is a real thing. So through repeated work and reconceptualization, you can retool those well-worn negative and unhelpful pathways in your brain. Another arena where research is happening is shifting your processing of feelings, realizing things like realizing facts are not feelings are not facts, I'm feeling like a fraud. No, that's a distortion. That's not real. I'm actually quite competent at what I do. There are ways, and I'm going to get to some of those better ways and techniques that you can use to help you deal with those feelings in the moments, and then things like challenging unhelpful thoughts. There are ways to, once you recognize you are stuck in unhelpful thoughts, how to disrupt those from happening, how to reinterpret situations, everything. A large part, and we're starting to learn a lot more about imposter phenomena, and it's linked to the body. So it's not just all psychological. Constant anxiety and fear is a bad thing for the body. It's a bad thing for our thoughts. And so there are ways, because our thoughts and our body and our feelings are integrally linked, there are ways to take advantage of those linkages in a positive way. I particularly have found in dealing with imposter phenomena, mindfulness practices are really quite effective. People have been studying the use of breath work, 6-4-6 breathing, square breathing, which is essentially their breathing techniques of 6-second inhales, 4-second holds, 6-second exhales, using that very strong link between your body and your nervous system to help reduce the anxiety you feel when you're experiencing imposter and fraudulent thoughts. There are some individuals that are trying and experimenting with cold plunge, the Wim Hof method, inducing a dive reflex or a vagal resets as a way to help trigger helpful changes in the nervous system to help cope with imposter phenomena states. There's also been some suggestion that that approaches to connecting with other people, humans, this phenomena and process known as co-regulation, reaching out and touching and being present with somebody, using their more relaxed state can help you bring down. Touch and co-walking have been also positive. As I said, the in the moment strategies that have been proposed that are out there, rapid reframing, correcting your thoughts, that to more correctly align with reality. I will often find myself, it's like, oh my God, you are so stupid. I make a small error, or I missed a number or transposed something due to dyslexia. I will often beat myself up, and I've learned to recognize when it's like, oh, you're so stupid. Okay, that's actually not true. There's multiple objective evidence that's not the case. And then working on some of those negative scripts about your relationship to failure and competency. Another thing, when you find yourself getting trapped into cycles of negative thinking around imposterism, fraudulence, etc., there's a technique called thought stopping, where you just say internally to yourself, stop. I mean, very, very forcefully, stop. That's not true. Interrupting rather than ruminating and getting stuck in those cycles, trying that and stop. That's not true. What's actually going on? What's reality? What's around you? What's more likely? Visualizations have been proposed to help individuals rewire and work some of these negative thought patterns around imposter phenomena, imposter syndrome, and other approaches. One from Kelly Vincent that made me chuckle was the bestie approach. Essentially, we're treating ourselves much more harshly than we treat those around us. So, in this particular strategy, you're asked to imagine your best friend comes to you with the complaints and the thoughts that you're having currently. What would you tell your best friend? Because we will often be much more generous, much more reality-based in counseling others than we are with ourselves, because of our history, because of those well-worn negative and unhelpful thought patterns. Um, so so out there, building resiliency. These particular techniques you could, I mean, of course, I just wanted to point you in the direction of things you can look at and investigate more that may help you. For myself, I think some of those shifting my relationship and understanding to failure has been really helpful. Getting that growth mindset has been quite helpful. Some of the other types of things that have been identified to help, when you're experiencing imposter phenomena, focusing on the facts, less than on the feelings and in the fears, getting a more realistic view of what of what your actual competence and what the actual evidence shows. Mechanisms for doing that include, creating lists for yourself. I even though it sounded to be silly at the start of things, having a folder of my achievements, of awards and papers and successes, and when I'm experiencing imposter feelings, going to that, said, no, here's the real objective evidence that things are better. I think these are things that are quite can be quite helpful. Imposter phenomena is a thing that occurs in isolation. And so I think connecting with other individuals, sharing your stories with other people, knowing that you're not alone, that other people are experiencing this, getting some external feedback, it can be quite helpful. I know, I realize I'm so enthusiastic about this topic and sharing with you guys. I realize our time is getting short, but for those negative scripts around competency, there are a number of ways to reframe those. Getting rid of shame when you fall short, remembering that you're human if you're a perfectionist. Ditching the expectation that you should know everything all the time. Really, it's really important to leave room for growth. Stop thinking that you have to do everything alone, and that competent people only don't get help. It's okay to share effort, and often you can get synergies and great things happening there. The natural genius, it's important that you recognize the time and effort that is required to achieve mastery in any subject. Allow yourself the joy of learning. You don't have to be perfect at everything. There is some joy in that. And the superhuman, you're human. You can't do it all at once, but you can honor yourself for the things, the multiple things you can do. You just don't have to be able to do everything really great. And lastly, I said, in that review from 2020, there were no published studies on treatment of imposter phenomena. Well, since then, some have come out, and I thought I wanted to share with you one that a very simple 3-session coaching intervention was developed by folks in Germany. A very nice, rigorous factorial randomized controlled trial was done. These coaching sessions consisted of 3 didactic one-on-one sessions, helping to support an individual's belief in self-efficacy and how to change to a corresponding growth mindset, changing those relationships to failure, and getting and how we value and consider our own intelligence and competency. And this was compared to an intention control group and no intervention at all. And it was found just with these three 1-week sessions over a very small amount of time, they saw significant decreases in that CLANCE imposter phenomena score. So they were starting to get more evidence that interventions specifically developed to deal with some of these unhelpful and maladaptive thought processes can be quite effective in reducing the experience of imposter phenomena. So, some very practical things to do, to help fight imposter feelings, making a list of 10 things that show that you're just as qualified as everyone else, learning to own your accomplishments, affirmations at first seem really silly, but the studies in psychology and neuroscience actually show that affirmations, as foolish as you may feel, actually work. And so those are some things too, but mostly I think it's that don't suffer and do this alone, because you're as we see from the prevalence, you're not alone in this. The process of sharing and discussing your experience of imposter phenomena with other folks actually is a great way to begin to disrupt that isolation and to help reorient yourself to the fantastic person and level of competency that you all truly really have. And so that's I think that's where we're at now. I'm really looking forward to our future discussions around this, but I wanted to give a quick rapid overview of my experiences and what I see out there and what I think is needed. There are a number of things I think that we don't know. I think this field needs significantly more development. One of the things I don't think that has been looked at quite a bit are the impact of microaggressions on and its impact on imposter phenomena, the efficacy of potential belonging interventions for those of us who are coming from marginalized communities. There's the potential impacts of generational trauma, we think, into the susceptibility to imposter phenomena. And probably one of the biggest things I think that we can change, and this is a step towards that, is we need to start teaching about imposter phenomena and providing skills and resources to combat it, because it is so frequent, particularly in the arenas that we're currently working in academia and medicine. And that's it. So this really should be a 2-hour session. I want to thank you for being present. I think in the future we'll do another one of these where we can share. People can share their experiences. We can talk about what's worked for you, and just have a more in-depth discussion of, now that we've kind of touched on like what's out there, what do we know, what do we don't know, and work towards building our own support network, particularly in our ISD working group. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the time we've spent with us, and we look forward to seeing you again to discuss this further.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charlebois. Very much appreciated this outstanding talk. And yes, we will continue on this topic at another session as well. Thank you.